In the current situation, NATO considers the likelihood of Russia using nuclear weapons against Ukraine low, but remains vigilant and closely monitors the status and readiness of Russian nuclear forces, especially during Russian nuclear exercises. NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg said this during a virtual speech at the Berlin Foreign Policy Forum today, an Ukrinform correspondent reports. "We are closely monitoring what they, the Russians, are doing. We are vigilant, especially now that nuclear exercises are about to take place. The risk of using nuclear weapons against Ukraine is low. But, of course, the potential impact and consequences of such a move could be so great that we should take it very seriously. We are signaling to Moscow that there will be dire consequences for Russia itself if they use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Right now we don't see any change in their nuclear positioning or readiness. But, of course, we continue constant monitoring," Stoltenberg said. He noted that the alliance must be ready for any scenario. The Kremlin is currently trying to intimidate its allies with its nuclear rhetoric into withdrawing support for Ukraine so that Putin can defeat Ukraine. "We cannot afford to be intimidated or succumb to blackmail and nuclear rhetoric. If President Putin wins in Ukraine, it will send a very dangerous signal to all authoritarian leaders that if they use brute military force in violation of international law, they can achieve their goals. This will make us more vulnerable and the world more dangerous. Therefore, we must take into account all the risks of this conflict, and also that the risk, if President Putin is allowed to win, will be much greater," said the NATO Secretary-General. Answering the moderator's question, he stressed that NATO had clearly delivered a message to the Kremlin about the dire consequences for Russia itself of using nuclear weapons against Ukraine, and recalled that Russia had put its signature under the document stating that there could be no victory in a nuclear war, and it should never be untied. At the same time, Stoltenberg acknowledged that the nuclear rhetoric coming from Moscow and President Putin is dangerous and crazy, so these threats must be taken seriously. He declined to elaborate on what NATO's response might be if the Kremlin leadership decides to use nuclear weapons. "It depends on what this attack will be, on the circumstances and context. But we will never give an advantage to a potential attacker by telling him exactly how we intend to respond. They, the Russians, know that the consequences will be severe, and we repeated this message several times in recent weeks," said Stoltenberg. According to him, NATO has different ways of responding, and they will not necessarily involve the use of nuclear weapons. As the NATO Secretary-General noted, the circumstances in which the Allies would consider the possibility of using nuclear weapons in response are very unlikely. But this does not preclude a decisive response from NATO if Russia uses nuclear weapons against Ukraine. If an attack is made on any ally in the alliance, this will immediately bring into force Article 5 of the Washington Collective Defense Treaty, Stoltenberg recalled. "Now we are doing everything to prevent such a scenario from happening. We are not a party to this conflict. We do not have forces at the site of the conflict, we do not participate in hostilities. Yes, we provide assistance to Ukraine, which has the right to self-defense in accordance with the UN Charter. NATO allies are helping Ukraine to exercise this right, but this does not make us a party to the conflict," Stoltenberg stressed. As reported, from the very beginning of the Russian invasion, NATO allies began to provide Ukraine with effective military assistance, including direct arms supplies on a bilateral basis. NATO as an alliance has focused on the supply of non-lethal military equipment to Ukraine, including fuel, personal protective equipment, medical equipment, anti-drone equipment, etc. Under the auspices of the United States, 6 meetings of the Contact Group on Ukraine in the Ramstein format have already taken place with the participation of more than 50 NATO and partner countries, which coordinate the supply of weapons and military equipment to Ukraine at the request of their military department. Ukraine's achievements against the Russian invasion are primarily the result of the resilience and determination of the Ukrainians and their armed forces, but assistance from NATO and individual allies in the alliance was also critical in turning the tide on the battlefield and liberating much of the occupied territories. NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg said this during a virtual speech at the Berlin Foreign Policy Forum today, an Ukrinform correspondent reports. The systems supplied by NATO and allies have already made a big impact on the battlefield. This is one of the reasons why Russia failed to secure air supremacy over Ukraine. This undermined the advantage of the Russian troops in the implementation of their operations. They hoped that they would easily seize control of the airspace of Ukraine, but they did not succeed, said Stoltenberg. He noted that such a result became possible, first of all, thanks to the skill and determination of the armed forces of Ukraine, which used the air defense systems at their disposal, the old Soviet-style systems. NATO allies have provided the Ukrainian military with munitions for such systems and delivered several new and improved air defense systems. One of the latest such examples is the supply of German systems. Germany, Stoltenberg noted, is supplying Ukraine with important military equipment, which will make even greater changes in the situation in the future. At the same time, the NATO Secretary General recalled that winter is coming, so providing Ukrainian troops with the necessary equipment, from winter clothes to generators and tents, has become one of the key topics of the recent meeting of NATO defense ministers, October 12 to 13th, edition, who expressed their readiness to help Ukrainian military to ensure their ability to operate effectively in winter conditions. He refrained from answering the moderator's direct question about when this war between Russia and Ukraine might end. Stoltenberg noted that war is inherently unpredictable. According to him, a significant Russian military presence remains in Ukraine, and the events of the past few weeks and even days represent the biggest escalation of the conflict since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. If you add together the mobilization and the forces that they, the Russians, can send to the front, the annexation of territories of Ukraine and the dangerous nuclear rhetoric of Russia, all this represents the greatest escalation since the beginning of the war. Therefore, we must again increase our assistance to Ukraine, and this assistance has proved its importance. This allowed the Ukrainians to push the Russians out of the areas around Kiev, contain the Russian offensive in the Donbass, go on the counteroffensive, liberate many territories in the Donbass and put pressure on Russian troops in the south, in the Kherson region, the NATO Secretary General said. Since we still see a large Russian presence, we must ensure that support for Ukraine is provided for a long time, as long as it is necessary, Stoltenberg added. As reported, from the very beginning of the Russian invasion, NATO allies began to provide Ukraine with military assistance, including direct arms supplies on a bilateral basis. NATO, as an alliance, has focused on the supply of non-lethal military equipment to Ukraine, including fuel, personal protective equipment, medical equipment, anti-drone equipment, etc. Under the auspices of the United States, 6 meetings of the Contact Group on Ukraine in the Ramstein format have already taken place with the participation of more than 50 NATO and partner countries coordinating the supply of weapons and military equipment to Ukraine at the request of its military department. NATO will soon provide Ukraine with the means to deal with new threats, including drone attacks on cities and civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. This was stated by NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg during a speech at the Berlin Foreign Policy Forum, an Ukrinform correspondent reports. No state should support Russia's criminal war against Ukraine, and this is a message from NATO, a message from allies, from the EU and many others. NATO will supply anti-aircraft systems, hundreds of installations to help them in the coming days or soon, Ukrainians, edition, counter the threat of drones, including Iranian-made drones, which are now causing great harm and suffering to Ukraine. We will deliver these funds in the near future, Stoltenberg said. According to him, the best thing NATO can do in the face of Russian barbaric strikes on civilian targets in Ukraine is to increase the supply of air defense systems to counter various threats, including strikes by ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, drones, etc. And all these types of weapons require different types of air defense systems. Ukraine is a big country with many cities. Therefore, we have a huge task ahead of us, to help protect all parts of Ukraine from various threats from the air, Stoltenberg said. Foreign Minister Dmitry Kuleba welcomed the NATO Secretary General's statement about the alliance's plans to supply Ukraine with air defense systems against drones in the coming days. I welcome the statement by Jens Stoltenberg that NATO plans to supply Ukraine with air defense systems against drones in the coming days. This is exactly what we discussed and asked for. For Ukraine, this means more lives saved and better protection of the energy infrastructure. Thank you NATO, Kuleba wrote on Twitter. As reported, on Monday, the Russian Federation launched 9 missile and 39 air strikes on Ukraine. According to the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Russia used cruise, aviation and anti-aircraft guided missiles for strikes. In addition, Russia continues to use Iranian-made Shahed-136 unmanned aerial vehicles. Since the beginning of the Russian invasion, NATO allies have been providing Ukraine with military assistance, including direct arms shipments on a bilateral basis. NATO has focused on the supply of non-lethal military equipment to Ukraine, including fuel, personal protective equipment, medical equipment, anti-drone equipment. The Russian authorities are trying to spread false information about NATO's alleged involvement in Russia's war against Ukraine. U.S. Permanent Representative to NATO Julian Smith stated this at the Berlin Foreign Policy Forum on Tuesday, an Ukrinform correspondent reports. Unfortunately, the Russians are quite successful in promoting a whole range of false narratives and lies about the role of NATO in Ukraine. They would just like to be able to point to some example of NATO's direct involvement in this conflict. But we are firmly committed to preventing this, she said. According to Smith, NATO allies agreed at the start of a full-scale war that they would not allow the alliance to become a party to the conflict. This decision was made very early and I don't see any cracks in the unity regarding this policy, she added. At the same time, individually, almost all countries provide humanitarian, economic and security assistance to Ukraine, although NATO itself does not coordinate or provide this assistance, Smith stressed. We are not sending NATO troops to Ukraine. There are no NATO commanders there, there is nothing in Ukraine that concerns NATO assets, and I do not expect this to change, she stressed. However, she said, sometimes in different corners you can hear countries asking questions that reflect the Russian lie. Is NATO in place? Does NATO provide lethal support? Is NATO to blame for this war? Smith noted that NATO allies should clarify to other countries whether these false claims of Russia have any relation to reality. As Ukrinform reported, after the start of Russia's full-scale military invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022, the EU, NATO and individual allies in the alliance began to provide Ukraine with effective military, financial and humanitarian assistance. At the same time, the allied countries provided Ukraine with weapons and ammunition to exercise its inalienable right to self-defense against external aggression in accordance with the UN Charter. For the first time in its history, the EU has allocated €2.6 billion for the purchase of weapons in the interests of Ukraine, a country in the stage of active hostilities. The number of air defense systems that we are supplied with is not enough to completely eliminate the missile threat. In addition, Russia is actively using Iranian drones, which it ordered in several batches. Major General Kirill Budanov, head of the main intelligence directorate of the Defense Ministry, said this in an interview with Obaz Revital, Ukrinform reports. The air defense systems that are supplied to us are absolutely small in number in order to completely remove the missile threat. However, our domestic defense industry is working to resolve this issue. In addition, we are looking for where you can buy any air defense systems in the world, and they supply something to us, he said. Budanov noted that the fact that the Russian Federation switched to the use of foreign drones is already an exceptional case for Russia. This was contributed by the low accuracy of Russian missiles, as well as their small number. According to Budanov, the Russian defense industry cannot produce enough new missiles, and those with which they went to war on February 24 are already running out. For many positions, this indicator has already fallen below a critical level, he says. I mean the level of 30%. Therefore, they were forced to look for some options to overcome the shortage of missiles. They got to the point that they began to use Iranian unmanned aerial vehicles. Can they replace missiles according to their characteristics? No, they cannot, but they need to proceed from the fact that there are now a sufficient number of them in the Russian Federation, and the accuracy of hitting UAVs is much higher than that of these missiles. They are counting on this, Budanov emphasized. He cited the following figures. The number of Iskander missiles in the Russian Federation approached the 13% mark, the available stocks in relation to the number at the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The military doctrine of the Russian Federation forbids falling below 30%, but the war makes its own adjustments. The chief intelligence officer noted that the first batch of drones in Iran was ordered in the amount of 1,750 pieces, then new orders follow, but it takes time for their production and delivery to Russia. They are gradually exhausting them. The Iranians are making new ones, but there is another side to this issue. We consistently shoot down about 70% of all drones, Budanov stressed. Answering the question whether anti-aircraft guns from Israel could increase the percentage of destruction, Budanov said that, unfortunately, this will not affect this situation in any way and guns will not solve the issue here. Serious air defense systems are needed. As reported, on Monday morning, Russia attacked Kyiv with 28 drones. 5 hits recorded. In particular, a residential building in the Shevchenko district of the capital was destroyed. The bodies of 5 victims of the Russian attack have been recovered from the rubble. The Iris-T anti-aircraft missile system is integrated into the air defense system of Ukraine. Yuri Ignat, press secretary of the Air Force Command of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, announced this at a briefing at the Military Media Center, Ukrinform reports. The complex has been successfully integrated into the air defense system of Ukraine, has good performance characteristics, so we hope to receive more Iris-T units from Germany. In addition, we are waiting for the NASAMS complex, which will also strengthen the air defense of our state, Ignat said. As reported, on October 12, Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov announced that the German Iris-T complex was already in Ukraine.